So while everybody is logging on, I just want to welcome you. My name is Angie DePoy, and I'm the Education and Research Liaison for the Fenway Foundation for Friesian Horses. For those of you who may not be familiar with us, we're a nonprofit 501c3 in Wisconsin, USA. The Fenway Foundation is dedicated to preserving and enhancing the longevity and quality of life of Friesian horses through research, rescue, and education. Everyone will be in listen-only mode for the webinar, but when you have a question at any time during the presentation, please just use the little Q&A button that's down at the bottom of your screen in the toolbar and type your question there. We do have a pretty large audience today, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. So today we'll be hearing about the latest research on training Friesian horses from Dr. Carolien Munsters. Dr. Munsters is a specialist in equine sports physiology. She obtained her PhD in this field in 2013 from the Faculty of Veterinary Medicine, Utrecht University in the Netherlands. And through her company, Equine Integration, she's on a mission to promote equestrian sports and the welfare of horses. This is achieved by translating scientific knowledge and measurements into practical applications to support riders, trainers, and coaches in improving the performance and welfare of their horses. For many years now, Dr. Munsters has been supporting and advising various international equestrians, Olympic teams, as well as amateurs and mounted police. In addition to her work with sport horses, she's an active researcher in collaboration with the Faculty of Veterinary Medicine, Utrecht University in the Netherlands, serving as an embedded scientist in equestrian sports and authoring several peer-reviewed articles. Since 2020, she's also been involved as a founding member of the Sport Horse Welfare Foundation. And now I would like to turn the presentation over to Dr. Munsters. Welcome, and thank you so much for taking your time today to present this important information. We have such a large audience that based on the number of registered attendees, we can certainly tell that this is a subject that the community is very eager to hear about. So thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you very much for inviting me and to have this presentation here. I just have a practical question because you mentioned the questions during the meeting. Do we handle the questions in between the presentation or after the presentation?
How would you like to do it? We can do it either way, whatever works best for you.
Yeah, I think maybe because sometimes we have questions which I will answer throughout the presentation, that maybe we go through the presentation and then combine, maybe some questions are already answered in the presentation and then we do them at the end. That's maybe
wonderful. That sounds wonderful.
Also, yeah, with the audience. Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for the very nice introduction. I will get started with this presentation. We will first go to some basic principles about equine exercise physiology. Then from that, I will take you to the several research studies we have performed with the Dutch Royal Studbook for the Friesian horses in the Netherlands and Utrecht University. And then we'll pile up all that research and come to practical guidelines for training your Friesian horse. So I hope today I can give you some information about, I think more than 10, almost 15 years of research we're doing on Friesian horses at the moment, and help you guide and train your horses better and improve the welfare, of course, for all horses. So we'll deep dive a little bit into equine exercise physiology, and there are two very important principles. One of the main principles is load versus load capacity, and there are two words that look quite similar, but load is actually what is the body asked to do. So all the things that we think a lot about physical demands, so you can think about duration, intensity, but it also ties a little bit more on muscle level and cellular level, like what are you asking the body to do? Then we're talking, of course, about the physical demands. It's not only muscles, but it also ties into the tendons, ligaments, bones, etc. So it's really the complete load you asked on the body. This is not only physical load. I would also incorporate here mental load, because I think if we're talking about load and load capacity, and of course I'm an equine exercise physiologist, so I talk a lot about physical load. We also want to take into account the mental load of the horse. So for load and load capacity, it takes as well mental as physical load together. So what is then load capacity? Load capacity is actually what can the body or what can those tissues handle. So it's a little of a scale. So you see that we have load and we have load capacity, and actually you want to have those two in balance. So you want to have that the load, what you ask from a horse, is in balance what the body of the horse can handle. And what we see is that there is dynamic balance between load and load capacity. And if there is a nice balance, so the horse is able to perform the demands, if it's like a mental or physical demands you ask from the body, we see that the horse is free of injury when that load is able to deal with that load capacity. However, what's important about this principle and how training works, it's a very basic principle, and we simplify it a little bit here for understanding, is that you need load capacity. So you need, if you want to grow that capacity, that the horse can do more, perform better, perform at a higher level, or when you start a young horse, can start carrying a rider, you need to increase the load capacity of that horse. That can only be done by applying load. Not only applying load, it's a combination of load and sufficient rest and recovery, of course, but it works also the other way around. If we have too much recovery, we see that the load capacity decreases. So it's a really dynamic scale that will always be applicable if you're resting, if you're training, and it's a balance that is continuously going on with horses and with humans, of course, as well. So why is this so important? Why do we need to know this? What is the load and the load capacity of your horse? And this ties a little bit already into the research, because we know that a lot of injuries are related to the balance between what you ask a horse to do, load, and it can be muscle load, it can be tendon load, ligaments, or bone loading, and what those tissues are able to handle, so the load capacity. So if we're going to talk about equestrian sports, we see a lot that we don't know exactly what kind of load we're asking from the horse. So if we're training a horse, and we train our horses every day, we see that it's not very clear or very objective. Okay, what are we doing with our horse? And we can specify that, of course, in duration and speed, but also in what we call internal load. What does it do for the body? What does it do for this horse? It can be that two horses perform exactly the same training, like maybe cover the same distance at the same speed, or do that at the same gait for the same duration. But for one horse, it can be a low intensity training session, and for another horse, it can be a high intensity internal load demand. And that's something you want to know, because if you know what the load is for the horse, then we can optimize the load capacity. And if you know both of those things, we can prevent injuries. And if we don't know those things, how can we then prevent injuries or increase the load capacity of our horse accurately? Now, that seems maybe now like a complete puzzle, but of course, you're not alone here. Not only me, but a lot of scientists, not only equestrian scientists, but also human scientists, because the same principle guide for humans have performed research into this. On physical level, on biomechanical level, and we see there are a lot of innovation. So it's not only combining science and data, it's really using it in combination with the experience and feeling you have with your horse. It can help you to assess and to objectify your feeling, like, is this a high intensity training session? Is this exercise difficult for my horse, or is it easy work and the body can handle this workload? And of course, we can talk about different dimensions of the body, like are we talking about the load on the muscle tissues or a tendon? Today, we will focus a little bit more on muscle load, but you can understand for the broader pictures, it ties into all kinds of tissues of the body. But here we can use the size and innovations that has been done. There is quite some knowledge out there, quite some innovative measurement tools which you can use to help and guide you to optimize these things. We will go through this also during this presentation. But to give you an idea, we see pictures here from a Dutch equestrian eventing rider in 1987, which was one of the first times they were using heart rate monitors, for example, during a big eventing course. And now already more than 10 years ago, it's just so normal to use sensors and heart rate monitors, for as an example, on a daily basis for their horses. It's the same what we see in human sports, for example, here with soccer, or you can have it in bicycling. But using and monitoring and tracking actually what you're doing during training, what those loads are, how it compels with your load capacity of the human body or a horse body. That's something that was like very new in the 1980s, but what we see is now already quite modernized and quite usable, and the knowledge is out there, the techniques are out there to do that on an easy way on a daily basis. And that gives us more information about, okay, what's going on with these horses and what is the correct load I should apply for my horse. So before we dive a little bit into the numbers specified for Friesian horses, I want to go into you with one of the major training principles I hope everybody understands after this webinar. And that's the training principle about the law of overload. So what you see here, and I hope you see my mouse as well, if correctly you see it. Yes, thanks, Angie. What you see here, this axis is actually your fitness level or the fitness level of your horse. But a lot of people think is that when we are training your horse, the horse will get better from training, correct? So we perform a training session and then you will improve. But actually what happens in your body is here we have a training stimulus. After that training session, we see that your current fitness level first decreases. So you are getting fatigued from that exercise. And depending, of course, on the demands of that exercise, you fatigue a little bit or you fatigue a lot. You can imagine for yourself, for example, to make it maybe simpler to understand, if you start running 5 kilometers and you do that right now, after that 5 kilometers, you will be more fatigued than when you're sitting now here, probably watching this webinar. So to fully understand how training works, this is a really important principle, because we have to understand that first from training, your fitness level decreases. And when are you improving? When is your body making adaptations? When are you getting better from training? Is here we see a compensation period or an adaptation period. That's actually after the training session. We have a recovery period, and during this period, your body at cell level and at all kind of levels, they are making adaptations. So the next time you're going to run 5K, you're better than the first time. And this point where you are better than before the training session, this is the point of what we call overload or overcompensation. There's the same words of different words, but used for the same principle. And this is actually where you are better. But what is really important to understand from this graph is that you get improved from training sessions after the training, followed by a recovery period. If we don't have a recovery period, your body or a horse's body cannot make those adaptations. So you cannot improve. So actually, where do you get better from your training? You get better during the recovery sessions, during the recovery training. And I will come closer in detail further on the presentation. What is then recovery for an Friesian horse or another horse? Because it, of course, depends on the age, on the training status, etc. But it's important to realize this principle, because a lot of times what I see in equestrian sport is that we still believe that we get horses fitter, stronger, getting more carrying capacity by actually training. And what they start to do if horses don't perform well, they start training more. And actually, it is not only training more, it is training more efficiently and applying accurate recovery periods. Because if you only start training more and you don't have recovery periods, the body cannot make this adaptation and you don't improve your horse. You even have the chance to make it worse. I will show you that in a bit. The second thing, what's really important about this is about this graph, of course, is a little bit a simplified representation of the reality, but it really helps to understand how training works in your body and in the body of your horse, is that here we have the point of overload. So here your body is better or has adapted. So the next time you're going to run 5K or your horse is going to perform that training session, it is better able to do that. But if you're not going to use this, so you're not going to apply the second training session here, it is the adaptations will decrease again. So those adaptations will go back, because making those adaptations requires energy from the body. And if you don't use that, your body's going to return this one and it goes back to basic level. So on a simplified way, and it is the same a little bit for humans. For example, if you train on Monday, you do an intense training session. Here you are on Tuesday, Wednesday is your recovery session. Thursday, you're on your best. You should apply the next intense training session, but you only train once a week. So Friday, Saturday, Sunday, you decrease again, and Monday you start all over. You can imagine, I always say, if you like doing sports, it's nice to do that, but it's not that effective. And if we're going to turn this over and look at our horses, it's really important to provide the right training stimulus, to have an accurate recovery period, but also to repeat several sessions and to do it in a correct manner so we really get improvement. Because if you train only just randomly, and sometimes you train on the right moment, sometimes you train too late, or you start too early when it's still in the recovery phase, we see that you apply load to that body which cannot be used effectively. And all the load you're going to apply to a horse, making kilometers, training your horse at walk, trot, canter, or driving with your horse, they're all loads that can help increase the injury risk if they're not applied effectively, if they're still recovery or already behind their adaptation phase. So that's really important about timing. And to give the first general tip here, if we talk about Friesian horses and we talk about the dressage and driving capacity here, we see that most of those horses benefit from an intense training session, and I will come later on in the presentation what is intense and how long and how etc. for a Friesian horse, followed by 1 or 2 recovery days. Then we see that most of those horses are at their overload point here at the 3rd or 4th day. So that can already help a lot of horses if you're just going to use a little bit the rhythm during your training week. How do you divide those 7 days a week? That you're going to divide it in, okay, we have a more intense training session, maybe shorter because it's a higher intensity. Then we have 1 or 2 light days, followed by another intense training session, followed again by 1 or 2 light days. And better to apply 2 days than 1 day if you want to be sure that the body is recovered enough. So this was a long principle for one graph. To make it a little bit more complex, hopefully not, but it probably will help you to understand training principles a little bit better, is that this is the graph we saw before. So this is the normal line. And you see then we get an overload. But if you train too light, always on a too light intensity, it doesn't stimulate the body as not enough to make those adaptations to get to that overload. So if some horse people we see are so afraid for injuries, they train too little, they train too less, how to say it correctly. And actually, then you also don't stimulate the body, because remember again the first slide, you need load to increase that load capacity. So a body can handle quite some things, so it's able to do normal training session. But if you train too light, it can also cause in the end injury, because horses get undertrained, and then you go to the same competition or maybe the same outdoor rides as the older horses, and the horses are still not able to cope with those physical demands. Another way what we see happening a lot is that horses are maybe not performing correctly. Horses are maybe, you find that the performance is down. You think, okay, his fitness is not good enough, so I'm gonna train harder. That's actually also not help, because if we train too hard, so here we see a very intense or long training session, but depending on what you ask, we see, of course, the stimulus, we get more fatigue, and the recovery period also takes longer. And after that recovery period, we also see no overcompensation here, because then the body is already quite happy that it can return back to the normal status as before the training session and has no extra, let's call it energy left to overcompensate it again. So what makes it really important to understand is that having the right training stimulus is quite important next to the timing. So when you train too light or you train too hard, it will not be effective. If you start too early with the next training session because you want to go on and maybe the horse didn't perform well, you're also probably not right, because he's still in recovery. If you train on a too late date, you do it like once a week or something, an intense training session, it's actually also a little bit of waste of all the load you apply to the body, because all those adaptations are starting to return already. So I hope this already helps a little bit in understanding, okay, how do we get to certain training status? And if we see horses and we evaluate fitness of horses, we, for example, see a poor performing horse and we know there's no veterinary underlying disease, it's probably fitness related, then we want to assess, is it having a poor fitness or a poor condition because it's training always too easy and that's why it's not improving, or if it's a horse which has been training too hard. So that's a puzzle you need to figure out, and that's where tools and monitoring can help to assess and to see if your feeling is the same as what actually is measured with your horse. So what you want to achieve in the end is optimal training. And optimal training means actually training more effectively. It's not meaning train more, it's training more effectively. And very important, this can only occur after the recovery phase. So here we see a training stimulus. You fatigue, we had a recovery period, let's say 1 or 2 days in Friesian horses. The next intense training session, a recovery period, another intense training session, a recovery period, etc. And we see that actually with less training, horses improve much more. So this is a little bit the rhythm you want to go in if we start improving horses and to apply less load, but still get nice, strong improvements in your horse. So it's really about the combination of training followed by recovery. Recovery can be in well-trained horses. It can be 1 hour of dressage training, but it can also be in young horses or maybe horses which don't have appropriate fitness levels already. It can be just a day off, and a day off always means an active day off. Free movement is super important for the recovery of horses. So no way recovery of how we call it, a rest day or recovery day means box rest, because box rest will definitely be detrimental for your recovery. So always, if you have a day that the horse is not training and it needs a recovery day, what we also call, or a resting day, it's always what I call active rest. So with free movement, and it also means sometimes, especially in young horses, not only sitting on it and walking, because each time as a rider you're going to sit on that horse. Maybe for the muscles it's low intense to do the walk, but again, all those ligaments, tendons and bones still need to carry that rider weight. So it's not, for some horses when they're young, etc., not a recovery training. So then free movement, like no rider on it, is actually a recovery day. Well, when we talk about well-trained horses, which are being ridden for many years, a recovery day can just be an easy day hacking around. But I would advise always check with the monitor to see how, if you're feeling what is a recovery day fits with the actual measurements. So to sum this up, don't train actually more, but trying to train more effectively and add good recovery moments. What we want to prevent is, of course, overtraining. So here we see your fitness level or your performance or power, depending on what the demands are, or your goals with your horse. Here we see a training stimulus. We have, again, the fatigue, we see the recovery phase, and then in the recovery phase, the next training stimulus is already applied. So then it was not fully recovered yet. The fitness decreases again. And sometimes we see that riders, they think if horses are not performing correctly, the fitness is not appropriately led, they think, okay, the more I train, the fitter it will get. But actually what happens is the more they train, so here we have a day, they trained very intensely, they have the next day, they should recover, but they are going to do the next training session. So it decreases again. Another day, the horses start performing less, so they start training more, and they decrease again, etc., etc. So you really end up in overtraining here. This is what we want to prevent, because, of course, overtraining is not a healthy state, not healthy for his welfare, but also is a very large risk to increase injury and overload injuries. So then we go a little bit more specific to Friesian horses. So what is then an optimal training for a Friesian horse? In the last I have to say, 14 years, we performed 3 large studies in collaboration with the the Friesian studbook in the Netherlands, and in collaboration, one of was during my PhD, and the latest studies were one of mine own PhD students in collaboration with Utrecht University. So I'm going to walk you through those studies, and from that we go to the practical guidelines. So I think that's the most logical way to start here. So we will go to what we call the ABFP tests that are actually the offspring tests, which we started in 2010 and 2011. So what did we do in those offspring tests? These were all offspring from 6 sires, and the question was here actually, what is the training load of those horses? How is the training program looking, and is it too much or too little for those horses? So we had at that moment 66 Friesian horses. We tested multiple offspring tests. I have to say it's not one test having 66 horses, but we tested more than a year all the offspring tests out there. All the horses were 3 and 4 years old, and we had a little bit of luck because all those horses came only from 6 different sires. They trained 5 days a week, and this offspring test had a duration of 7 weeks. The training was then demanded by the training leader from the Dutch Friesian studbook. And what we added there is that we applied exercise tests in the 2nd week and in the week before they had their final exam. Why didn't we do this in the 1st week? Because these were a lot of times there were mare geldings coming to the new accommodation, getting used to the new rider. So we don't want to then add again also exercise tests and more tension. We first want them to settle in a little bit and then perform an exercise test, which is also more reliable than doing it on the first day they enter a new accommodation. And we do that also in the end. We don't want to disturb the judges, etc. So a little bit before the last test, we did the final exercise test. So not a super long training period from 7 weeks. To fill you a little bit in, what is an exercise test for Friesian horses? It's very simple, actually. And we use this test a lot for young horses. We use this also in other research studies for riding school horses, police horses, but also for warm blood sport horses, young horses. So that's why we also use it for Friesian horses, so we can compare about their fitness status and conditional work. And the exercise test entails 2 minutes of walk on the left hand, 2 minutes of walk to the right. Then they continue directly in 2 minutes of trot left, 2 minutes of trot right, and 2 minutes of canter left and 2 minutes of canter right. In those middle times between trot and canter, they were quickly stopped to draw some blood so we could take some lactates, and they were continuously measured with heart rate and GPS. And what I already said, in the final week, they had the final judge exams. So what did we saw here? We saw here that in those 5 days training per week, we saw that 70% of the horses became fatigued during the final exercise test. So that was quite astonishing, because we have done this research also with 3-year-old warm blood young horses, and there we didn't saw any fatigue, not that these high lactate levels and heart rate levels. But here we saw also that we had Friesian horses that already fatigued at 4 minutes of trot. And most of the horses fatigued after 2 minutes of canter. And what I mean with fatigue is that their lactate levels start to really increase and they become a little bit above the anaerobic threshold. We evaluated that in comparison what they're actually doing during the training program. And during the training program, they did more trot and canter work than during the exercise test. So that gave us an idea about, okay, what are they actually doing and how is this translating to the fatigue we see in the exercise test. So what was, I found it funny, was somehow, otherwise it's physically quite correct, because we saw that the judgment score was related with the level of fatigue of the horses, which meant that horses which were less fatigued had higher dressage scores. And that means actually that the judges are able to score very well, probably the coordination of those horses, because the first thing that happens when you are fatiguing is that your coordination goes down. So your tact, or how do you call it in English, goes down in the rhythm of the gaits. So they actually scored that very well. On the other hand, you can wonder that if are you scoring fitness or are you scoring gait or quality of the horse? Because we saw that horses which are fatiguing more got lower judgment scores. But maybe if these horses are trained differently, or maybe if they were not fatiguing, they were able to give the same scores. So that rose already a few questions here. What we also saw, we saw large individual differences between those horses, and it puzzled us for quite some time to figure out what was going on with these Friesian horses. And we know that there are quite certain genetic things going on in Friesian horses, but when you want to do genetical research in horses, you need not 66 horses, but hundreds of thousands of horses, for example, to do this work. So we actually didn't expect in the beginning a genetical component here. But we saw like horses which responded well to the training program, or well, we defined at least, we had that 70% that became fatigued, but we had a group of 20, 30 horses percent that did not super fatigued during these exercise tests. We had a group that was a little bit in the middle, and we had horses that were really got even worse or through the program. And in the end, we know from human science and from human research that we have different responders. We have individual responses to training programs, which in humans, it's called high, low, and non-responders, which means if you're going to take a group of humans and they perform all the exact same training program, as was done with this Friesian horse, they all did exactly the same, we see different responses. You see that not all humans, and so all horses, respond the same to the same training program. So in humans, we know that we have high responders, for example, for strength training, and we have high responders for endurance training. Most of the time, both different groups of humans. And we have low responders for strength or endurance training, and we have non-responders. So if you apply a training program to a group of humans, you will see that some humans will get very strong or increase their stamina a lot. And we have humans that respond a little bit, and we have humans that do exactly the same amount of training sessions. They sweat, they are fatiguing a lot, and they don't improve almost nothing. So this is what we saw in the Friesians as well, because we only had 6 father animals. We started to look if this principle also applied to the horses. And what we saw is it was very high related with the father and the father animals of those horses. And we saw that we had a group of high responders, low responders, and non-responders to the same training program. So this was actually the first time it was proven in horses that the same principles we see in humans apply also for horses. So one training program fits all also doesn't count for horses. We nicely published this all in the veterinary journal. So for people who want to dive into research, find your reference here. I'm not going to do this deeply here. But the question raises then, is this horse related? Is it the Friesian horse? Or is it related to what we ask from the horse? Or is it its age? Are they too young? Because that's, of course, also a topic that raises the questions here. So we had the chance from the Friesian studbook in the Netherlands to repeat this research. Of course, we got a bit wiser from the first research and had extra research questions and things we wanted to measure to find out and get answers to these research questions. And we were able to do that with the central examination of the potential studbook stallions. So we did this first research in 2020 with Esther Sigets, my PhD student. And here the central examination in the Netherlands for the studbook stallions is actually 10 weeks. What we did during that 10 weeks, we applied 3 exercise tests. So we did one at the beginning. In week 1, we did the second exercise test in the middle after their, what they call here, the saddle exam. And in the second period of that central examination, they start doing more driving training. And then we did the third exercise test before the end of the central examination period. So the first weeks were mainly trained, the horses were mainly trained under the saddle, and the last 4 weeks they were more trained for driving. In general, all horses were trained around 5 days a week. We also evaluated the training sessions before the stallions were delivered, how do you call it, brought to the central examination training program. So we evaluated what they called the pre-exam days by the judges. So we were able to measure their also heart rate and lactate levels of those horses. And we did some questionnaires about for the training and the studbook owners, or sorry, the stallion owners, to at least let us know what they have been doing during the training before they entered this central examination. During the central examination, each stallion was equipped with a heart rate monitor and an accelerometer. So we didn't record GPS because everything was indoors. But this gives us information about the intensity during training and exactly the time spent per gait. So how many minutes walk, trot, and canter they did, the total duration, and at which intensity. And we had additional to that the exercise test, where we were also able to measure the lactate levels of individual horses. So why is this so important? We wanted to quantify the training load. We really want to understand what is actually asked from the body of these horses, and what are they able to deal with, and what are they did already before they came into the central examination, and what is asked from them during that central examination period. So we divided that to what we call external load. So that's everything you can apply to a horse, like the duration of a training session, the frequency of training, or the frequency of exercise bouts. You can talk about the distance they travel or which speed they are trained. And the internal load reflects a little bit, how does the horse respond to this training load? How does the horse respond to this walk, trot, canter training? And that's more related to heart rate and lactate levels. So we see here that when we evaluate the training programs with the 3 sets, a little bit the numbers we had in the first year, we had 32, in total we had 32 horses. Of course, we don't have that much potential studbook stallions as we have offspring horses coming to those offspring tests. So in the first year we had 16 horses, and in the second year we had also 16 stallions. They were all ranging from 3 till 4, and 1 5-year-old was there. And in the first year, in 2020, they had the regular training program as told by the Friesian studbook, where they were trained 4 till 5 days a week. And in the second year, we adapted the training program. They trained less days per week, and they also did less canter. So now we're going to dive a little bit into the numbers of this research. Here you see the, how do we call it, the external load from the original training programs. So what you see here, this is what they did in their preparation. So of course we don't have the exact durations estimated because we couldn't measure that. So it's only like frequency. So they were trained around 4.5 days a week, but you see a standard deviation of 0.9. So it's around 4 till 5 days a week. They did mostly dressage, a little bit of lunging, and a very little bit of driving. During the 70-day test at 10 weeks, we had the first period where they're mostly trained on the saddle, and the second period is where they mostly trained while driving. And in both periods, they were trained around 5 days a week, 4.7. Of course, in the first period, it was more dressage training, and that was less, of course, during the driving period. And here the driving increased more. And of course, the driving was less in the first period. What we saw is that in total, they were trained in the first period around 144 minutes a week, and in 131 minutes a week in the second period. And you see a little bit the differences per gait. I'm just going to point out a little bit here, they canter around 10 minutes on average per week, and in the second period they canter around 8 minutes per week, which makes a total of around 30 minutes per week per session. Sorry for all the numbers, you can always read it back, but just to get an idea, because I will go in the next time to the adapted training program to get a little bit understanding. So half an hour, 5 days a week on average, and in total per week, 10 minutes of training, 10 minutes of canter, sorry. So how did the horses respond to this training program? Here, the word set is standardized exercise test. So this is the first standardized exercise test in the first week, then in the middle, and this is at the end. Here we see the heart rate, and here we see the lactate values. And for both physiological parameters, we see the same pattern. They still perform the same, exactly the same load training as what they did in the first exercise test. During all those exercise tests, they perform that test with 2 minutes walk, left, right, 2 minutes trot, left, right, 2 minutes canter, left, right. But what you see is where they start here in the first exercise test with this heart rate and a lactate level a little bit more than 3. You see that during that training program, we ask exactly the same effort, but they start finding that effort more demanding. So this is actually, as we see, an increase in fatigue throughout the central training program. So the horses still do the same exercise here, but it costs them much more energy. They're much more fatigued than when they did it at week 1 compared to week 2. So what we know, of course, is then when horses get more fatigued from the same effort, this is really an indication of overtraining. So what we saw actually during that training program from 2020 is that training program was too demanding for those horses. Actually, we didn't saw it with one horse. We saw that all horses got higher lactate levels compared to the first or second exercise test. So it was too demanding. Also, this research is nicely published in Animals. It's also open access, so you can look back to all the figures and numbers if you want. And the nice thing was that from the Friesian studbook, I always find it nice because you can do 2 things as a studbook. You can then put this research somewhere on your desk and never talk about it anymore. But you can also be brave and you can say, okay, now we know we didn't do it right. So they came actually back to us with the question, okay, we know this was not optimal, but what would you advise us to do? How can we make this training program better? How can we improve the welfare of these horses? And that was actually quite good because we do a lot of research and we always hope that we take this into action as actually helping horses to improve and not to stay research desk options. So we got back in the year after that. What we did is we adapted the training program based, of course, on our first research we did in 2010, etc. 2010, but also on other research we have performed on different horses, disciplines, etc. And what we say, okay, we're going to adapt the training programs, and these are the major adaptations we made. We reduced the training sessions, so maximum 3, with an exception around to 4 training days a week, which means including lunging. So when a horse was lunged for a day, that meant it was trained. So if you needed to lunge that horse, for example, 2 or 3 days a week, it means you have less training sessions left to do dressage or driving. So in total, 3 or 4 days a week. Then what was really important, alternate training days with recovery days. I talked a lot about in the beginning about that whole overload principle, but that ties into this one. Because what was happening in the first training program, next to the training load they applied, is that the timing of training load was also not optimal because they trained 5 days a week from Monday to Friday, because then the riders are available and the trainers. Then in the weekend, they had 2 days off, and then again 5 days in a week. So that's also far from optimal. So although it took a little bit of a practical application here to alternate between training and recovery days, because it meant that also the riders and the trainers need to come now in the weekends and sometimes train those horses, but also give those horses free movement, because that was also another adaptation we made. Recovery days were active. That meant that all horses should have free movement during those recovery days. So not box rest, but recovery days. So that was a bit of an adaptation because they needed to be there like 7 days a week, put those horses in and out also throughout the weekends, and alternate between training, recovery, and then training again. Another one adaptation we applied was the variation in training. So they had light training session where they only performed walk and trot, so no canter was allowed. And then they had more intense training sessions where they were allowed to canter. We reduced the amount of the duration of the intense bouts. Most horses, it was canter, but also trotting, like 1-2 minutes maximum. Because if we talk about high intensity, 1 or 2 minutes is already long. If it's low intensity, you can do it longer. And alternate, for example, those short bouts of canter with walking bouts, so they can recover in between the training session. So we try to distribute the work better. So also not only saddle 6 weeks and driving then the last 4 weeks, but also divide a little bit the driving in the first 6 weeks. What was also important is, of course, in the preparation to the central exam, that we helped the stallion owners and the stallion trainers that more training is not better. So that they still able to train those horses, but we gave them guidelines. Don't train them more than 3 times a week, maximal 20 minutes. Take walk breaks. Don't train too much, because if those horses go towards the central examination and they're already almost overtrained because they had a very intense training period with that stallion owner or that stallion trainer, then of course it comes out during the central examination period. Well, maybe it was not the program itself. So that's what we try to help them also and guide them that, okay, these young horses, what we have learned from the first 2 research studies is that around 3 times a week is probably more than enough. So this is again the graph of the table, sorry, for the outcomes we saw in the second adapted training program. So I will point out a little bit some figures. You see, if you just look about the numbers, they train, of course, less times a week, not 4.7, but 4.3 times a week. It seems a little different. It's the same about if you then calculate how long the duration was for a session. First it was 30 minutes, now it's 26.7 minutes. Small difference, you would say. Oh yeah, sorry. First this one, then the other one. And in total, so the total durations per week, we see, because of course they trained a session less, it's around 29 minutes less. They walked a little bit less. They trotted 1 minute less per week, and they cantered 2 minutes less per week in the first period. And in the second period, it was around a little bit the same, a little bit less canter, of course, and less, because here they did a little bit more driving, and you don't canter while they're driving with those horses. So if you just look at these numbers, it seems very minor differences. We're talking about minutes per week. If you talk about 2 or 3 minutes less of canter per week, divided over 2 or 3 training sessions, it's like 1 minute per session less. That means if you don't record what you're doing during that session, you easily canter on and make 30 seconds 1 minute longer. And if you add that up on a total of the week, you do much more than you probably thought you were doing. So what was the effect of this adapted training program? Here we see the graph, and here we see again standard exercise test 1, 2, and 3. We have here the lactate levels of those horses. They start again, and here we see the lactate levels also after canter and the recovery. They start again at the same intensity what we saw in the year before, around 3 in the first lactate levels. But actually what we see now, for the same workload they do each exercise test, the work gets easier. It takes them less effort. We as researchers would already be happy if they don't increase in fatigue anymore in the 10 weeks. We would be happy if they would stabilize like they did in the first week. And actually this was also a surprise for us that it worked even better than we expected, because we saw that all horses improved and got fitter. And in week 10, they were more easy to do the same work at walk, trot, and canter compared to the first week. So we saw nice fitness improvements here in all those stallions. So what does it teach us this? It's a very thin line between overtraining and fitness improvement. We're talking about a few minutes or 1 training session less a week, which is the difference between going from overtraining or fitness improvement. And what I find also a very important lesson, and we've seen this, of course, in multiple studies regarding young horses, it's not actually sometimes the age of the horse, it's what you ask from the horse. If you do it with consideration and not asking too much, those horses are able to handle those loads. But if you ask too much, and especially with young horses, overtraining occurs very easily. So take training, especially with young horses, very moderately, take them light, don't do too much. And what is also important for Friesian horses, because we hear, and maybe it's the Netherlands, but we hear sometimes, Friesians, they're not good sport horses. But actually, if you train, you adapt a little bit their training programs, we see that they're as fit as warm blood horses, and they could perform the same trainings as good and as fit as the other horses. But you need to adapt the training program, because if you started to train like the first training program, they could not adapt to that. And then they got overtrained and got injured. And of course, they don't perform well in sports. But if you adapt the training program a little bit, we're talking not about major adaptations here. We talk about fine tuning those things. We saw that those horses got fitter and they could easily canter and trot, and it got better for those horses. So I want to point out again, seemingly small changes can make big differences. Again, this study is published, also open access. It's what we called part 2 of the training program study. And now you probably want to know how this impacts my training regime for my Friesian horse. The first thing I want to share with you is that what we learned for Friesian horses is really monitoring. Of course, also advise it for warm blood sport horses, but for Friesian horses, I think even more, because not even only young Friesian horses, but we also did a lot of testing with the older Friesian horses, with their talent squad and horses which already did dressage at national level or even Grand Prix level. And we still saw the same issues which we saw with young horses. Those horses there were still horses which were not well adapted to the training. They were still having trouble with walk, trot, or canter exercises. And because Friesian horses have such a good character, they have such a willingness to work for the rider, you don't always see that. You don't see it as easy as with other horses on the outside. They keep having their ears pricked forward. We ask riders also in the 2010 research, we asked them again in 2020, how does the horse feel? And always the rider said, yeah, it feels good. It's looking fine. It looked happy, and it looked also happy. But actually, when we stopped measuring heart rate and lactate values, we saw that they were quite fatigued. But they're very tough for themselves. How do you say it? They're very willing and have a very good character to keep on going, which makes it, I think, for you as a rider or as a training for Friesian horses, even more difficult to assess on the outside what is a intense exercise or when is my horse fatigued for a Friesian horse. We measured values in these horses where normally when I do eventing horses or warm blood sport horses, we see those horses, they stand there, okay, now I'm tired. And those Friesian horses standing, okay, I'm here. And we were really in the first study in 2010, we're sometimes doubting our equipment. And we did some lab testing because the horses looked so normal with these high values. So I want to point out monitoring, helping here with objectifying what is really going on with your horse is helping because they have such a good character. On the other hand, we also see that probably a lot of Friesian horses gets overtrained, especially amateur horses, because what we see if they don't adapt training programs, just riding outside, and then we see here a lot like Friesian horses are used for recreational riding, which is perfectly fine, but then make sure that those horses are fit to do the demands you ask from them, because riding outside for 2 or 3 hours and do a lot of cantering is, for all horses, can be demanding, but for Friesian horses, it's also, we know now how difficult it can be if to make them fit. They can do the work, I'm sure of that, but you really have to train them properly. So if we're going to talk more in depth, what is then intense for your horse? We saw what I said also at later stages, many Friesian horses are still not fit enough. So many horses, even when they performed at higher levels of dressage, they did it at high intensities, not only heart rate, but also in lactate levels. So it was not always visible for the rider that it was so demanding for the horse. And that means you have to treat it, if it's demanding for your horse, like high intensity exercise. So keep the bout short. Even it's a high level horse, we saw that if we changed training programs and we started to treat them a little bit like short bouts, high intensity, alternate them with walking periods, it takes a few weeks, but then those horses start to improve. In Friesian horses, there are also quite some individual differences, which makes it, again, sometimes more difficult to assess from the outside if it's your horse that is fit enough for the physical demands you ask, or if it's a horse which has very good character, but maybe hides a bit from you that he is fatiguing and struggling a little bit to do the work. What we saw, for example, which we were a little bit lucky with, is with the riders during the studbook exams. Well, for the studbook, the stallion exams, we had the same group of riders. And in the first year, we asked them again, okay, how is your horse feeling? How are the stallions feeling? They felt normal, they felt fresh. But actually, you only know what you feel if you have felt it. How do you say that? Proper English. Because in the second year, then suddenly we ask again, we do also some subjective, like, okay, how is the horse feeling? And then during around the second exercise, the rider said, now the horses feel so much fresher. Normally during this period, we feel they're a little bit, let it a little bit dull, but they're so energetic, they're so fresh, they're still standing. And then they said, we do this work already for years, and now we see that actually the horses were less fit last year, but now they didn't know. You don't know what you don't know. So now they felt this is actually a fresh stallion, and they keep on being energetic and able to do the work and maintain the work easily throughout the whole training program. And then they realize, maybe the years before that horses were maybe less, they still did the work because of the good characters, but maybe it was a little bit more demanding than they thought it was. So to have an idea, what is a good recovery training for your horse? A general guideline with that is that a low intensity training session is a heart rate under 120 beats per minute. That means includes also canter. If you cannot canter in a heart rate below 120 beats per minute, it means you cannot canter during a recovery training session. If your horse cannot trot on the heart rate of 120 beats per minute or lower, it means you cannot trot during a recovery training. You can only walk or give him free. And if we talk about young horses, I would say if it's now 3-year-old or a 4-year-old and you start training session, the first 1.5 years you start your horse, if he's 3 or 4, it doesn't matter. A 4-year-old still needs around the same time to be able to adapt to rider weight, etc. It takes 1.5 years. So the first 1.5 years you start training your horse. You cannot train more than 3 days a week with those horses, and recovery periods mean no rider on the horse. So free movement and unloaded exercise, or how we call that. So training advice, if we go to basic dressage, realize that sometimes it can be already quite demanding for Friesian horses. If we talk about driving exercise, even the trot, it's very large differences between horses and driving exercise. Some horses find it very easy, some horses very high intense. So please assess that and know that from your horse, and accordingly you can adapt your training program. If it's high intensity, treat it as high intensity, which means short interval bout. 1-2 minutes max is already long for trot and canter, and then you cover in between with periods of walk, at least also with 1 or 2 minutes of walk. And then you can repeat this one for 2 times, maybe 6 times of these intervals per session. Of course, when it's a young horse, you're more around 2 or 3 times per session, but when it's more an amateur horse, you can increase those intervals. You will see that your horse will start improving because it is able to recover and not do too much. The second training advice is don't canter each training session. If you have a horse which is not performing properly, or you doubt a little bit if his fitness is good enough, recovery periods, canter is most of the time a bit demanding for the Friesian horses. They really need to treat it as high intensity exercise. So give them days of lighter work with only walk and trot. And if you do canter, keep it short in the beginning, like maybe 30 seconds, maybe even 20 seconds of a very young horse, and then slowly increase the duration. And duration talks about around 2 minutes again, if we talk about high intensity work. You can only start increasing the duration after 2 minutes if your horse is able to canter on lower intensity. So it starts to get like a heart rate of 120, 130 beats per minute, then you can start increasing the duration. And alternate, of course, 1 intense day followed by 1 or 2 recovery days. Another point I want to point out here, if you doubt whether your horse is performing properly, or maybe it's a poor performing horse, always first check with your vet, see if there is not a veterinary underlying disease for these horses. And if you're really sure it's no underlying respiratory cardiovascular disease or anything, then you can start working on his fitness and condition. If you need help, of course, we're specialized in training advice and optimizing fitness and training programs, and we're always happy to help you. So just for the formality, I will give you some information here if people want to know more, because we really want to do everything science-based, but also really there to help people forward and to get better training with their horses. Then for the last part, I want to thank, of course, my team. This is not me only here presenting this work. This is me and my students and all the people from the Friesian studbook who help performing all these studies. So I hope I'm very happy with their help and the nice things we are able to do together. So I want to close here with the questions, and I see some questions in the Q&A, but
yeah, I will moderate these for you and read them out. I think some of them you may have touched on, but we'll go through them. So Melissa asks, is there something known about the blood anemia and not very good functioning of the liver in the same time with Friesian horses? My Friesian has 1 to 2 times a year anemia.
Yeah, I just thought too.
And not good functioning liver, and he does carriage driving, which is marathon driving in the Netherlands, and dressage level 2 in Belgium. He's well trained, but maybe not yet strong enough, she's asking.
It's multiple questions in one question, and I'm just took out the chat to read, understand that I understand the question correctly. If there is something about the blood anemia, first you need to know if it's confirmed by vet that it really is blood anemia, because I think that's the first thing to know, and what causes, of course, that blood anemia. Then again, it's a bit, okay, what are you able to do? And probably measuring your horse with heart rate, lactate levels, or at least do an exercise test to see where he is at. Then you can answer the question, okay, is he fit enough to do that marathon, or are we a long way to go? And then from that, during monitoring your horse, you can see how far can I improve with his fitness level till he's maybe getting there to do that properly. He's getting fit enough, or maybe he's not fit enough. Yeah, I cannot answer that question in one time to see if that horse gets fit enough, but I would start first knowing what reason is he has this, and then go from there with actually monitoring that you don't overload your horse.
Super. Pauline asks, does a recovery day have to be a no work day, or could you go for a gentle hack or a walk in hand?
Okay, it's a good question. Yeah, definitely you can also go for a walk in hand. And if it's an older horse, so not talking about young horses, so he's used already to your rider weight, etc., it's perfectly fine to go, for example, for a nice hack walk or a little bit of trot. And to know if it's recovery, that's why I use the heart rate monitor a lot, and see for your horse. Some Friesian horses are quite able to do a whole hour of nice hacking or dressage work on very low intensity as walk and trot, then you're perfectly fine to do that as a recovery day. But if you have horses which have a high intensity already at trot, or they find it demanding to trot, yeah, then you cannot do that for a longer period, because then the body cannot recover. But yes, you can. It's not only free movement, you can also do a hack if it's an older horse, or walk in hand, or do groundwork with those horses. That's also, of course, up to you and what fits the horse the best.
And next question talks about young horses. So could you clarify what like give us an example of a recovery day for a young horse? Would that be hand walking, just carrying a rider at the walk, trail riding, etc.?
No, for a young horse, and then I'm talking the first 1.5 years of those horses, definitely, I would say a recovery day is really without load carrying rider weight. And that has to do also because we look a lot with heart rate and lactate levels to how muscles respond to training, but we also have to tie into the tendons, ligaments, and the bones, and they have longer adaptation time. So for that reason, maybe your horse is able to walk already, still the bone cells, etc., needs to have time to adapt from that loading as well. So for that reason, I'm really advocate for non-load bearing work, and of course always a bit of free movement, because I think all horses should have free movement possible, if possible. Yeah.
And then Georgia asked, for the exercise test, is there a rest period other than like when you're drawing the blood, or
No.
Is this a timed rest like you would see like at an endurance event where they say you have to stand still for so many minutes?
Yeah, actually for the exercise test, and that's a bit because we want to see how well horses cope with the exercise we ask from them. They don't have a recovery period in between. So only they stand still for 10 seconds to draw blood, and then they continue again. And that is just a practical reason because we cannot draw blood when they're riding around in the riding arena. But if you incorporate recovery periods, which you are not doing during an exercise test, but you are doing during a training session. So really be clear here that the exercise test for us is to really make reference values for those horses to see, okay, are they able to maintain 2 minutes of trot or 4 minutes of trot, or are they only maintaining 2 minutes and after 4 minutes they are starting to fatigue? If we let them walk in between, they recover already so much that, again, they need to do a longer exercise test. So we don't want to do a longer test. So for the exercise test, you don't have recovery periods, but if the horse is getting fatigued during trot or canter, then of course during training you apply exercise recovery bouts by walking in between, so it doesn't get a too intense training session.
And then I think I probably know the answer to this question already, but Patrice asked if you can share the stallions, which offspring of which stallions responded well to testing.
No, yeah, I now maybe I can. I only know those horses enormously by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So even if you would ask me, I have no idea which stallions it are.
Super. Okay, and then Darlene wants to know, do you find that Friesians tend to have more overbreathing with short duration exercise, like around 15 minutes or so of light intensity exercise versus other breeds? And if so, are they more dangerous to this type of fatiguing?
And for overbreathing, but maybe that's my English. Do you mean the panting then? So or what?
I think she means rapid, like respiratory rate.
Yeah. So that's what we call panting. It's a bit what we see a lot, and we measured also in the first 2 studies the temperature of those horses, because we see that Friesian horses, we thought they would get warmer, and that's why they increase their breathing rate more rapidly than other breeds. We see that more often there. At that time, we couldn't find a relation between their rectal temperatures and their breathing rates. But it is thought that if horses presumably do light exercise, and again, you come here a little bit, is it light exercise? Which we see that for a lot of horses, Friesian horses, it is not light exercise. Then, of course, they start breathing more, and depending on the environmental climate, you have to realize that horses will get more hot than humans. They get hot quicker, but also we saw from other studies where we did thermoregulational studies and acclimatization studies that horses around 20 degrees of wet bulb globe temperature, they already have what we call uncompensable heat stress. It's not directly a problem, but they will start breathing more, getting hot. And when you put that together with high intensity exercise, Friesian horses are probably breathing faster more than other warm blood horses.
Erica, and I know you kind of touched on this, but she asks, can a recovery day be something like just in-hand work or free lunging?
In-hand work, yes, if presumably that you do that mostly at walk, or maybe a little bit of slow trot, but mostly at walk. Free lunging, I would be very cautious with that, because lunging actually is for a lot of horses, and not only Friesian horses actually, lunging is for a lot of horses more demanding than riding, doing a dressage training session. And of course you have lunging and lunging, you can do a little bit of easy lunge and you can do really training lunge. But with lunging, a lot of horses walk and trot and canter more on a small circle, which is more demanding, not only for the muscle, but also for the tendon and ligaments, than when you do dressage riding in a arena which is bigger. So yeah, if you start lunging and they trot and canter more than during a training session, it's not a recovery, it's actually an intense training session.
So on that line of thinking, lunging would be treated as a training session in most cases, right?
Yes.
That's important for people to realize, because there's a lot of people that lunge, whether it's in a round pen or on a line.
And we did some measurements also, of course, during the lunging sessions, and we saw that most of the time the lunging was even more intense for those horses than the normal dressage training sessions. And it just has to do, even without that they didn't have a rider, it has to be do with the fact that they trotted and cantered more and on a small circle, which is more demanding than, less trot and canter.
Yeah,
during
that's
dressage.
very important information. This question says, my Friesian is very forward going, intense, and only relaxes after about 20 minutes or more of work. So how does she work out a program for him, given the fact that he's so tense and doesn't relax?
Now, yeah, the first thing you need to answer here is is it the demanding training program that 20 minutes? Is it the low? Maybe your horses, there are fit Frisian horses. I'm not advocating here that there are no fit Frisian horses. There definitely are, but it's just that you need to first know which category is my horse. So is he stands because it's a low intensity exercise and he just has energy enough to do the rest, then it's no problem that it takes 20 minutes. But what we also see is that horses are still flight animals. And I see that not only with Frisian horses, but also more in thoroughbred and the eventing horses, that some horses, which when they are getting fatigued, they start to go a little bit what I call on the flight modus. They start to walk on their adrenaline. And when those horses get fitter, you see that they need less adrenaline and they get actually calmer. And it's quite sometimes the opposite what riders expect, because they think those horses are tense, they're very spooky. And when they start training more, they will get more energetic and more fit and more spooky. But actually, if you have a horse which is really fatiguing and then still is tense, it can happen that he is tense because he's fatiguing. That's a little bit his survival mode. So to answer what is a good training program for the horse, you should first start measuring what is normal for that horse and go from there. Because if it's low intensity, he can do more. If it's high intensity, maybe he is already doing too much. And the reason he stands is because it's a little bit in his overdrive.
It's funny that you say that, and I know I'm assuming that you did some work with Peter Spahn, because we recently interviewed him for our podcast, and he mentioned this when we were talking about, you know, selecting a horse for dressage. He said you really need to pay attention to this, you know, kind of myth that's out there that some Friesians are bolters, because it might be that the training exercise is just too difficult for them, and they're looking. A lot of Friesian horses will deal with that because their character is so good, they'll put up with it, but some, you know, it really stresses them out and upsets them. And so they're looking for some way to escape the training. So it's not necessarily always that the horse is frightened. It might just be that they're super fatigued.
Yeah, and that's a bit that's why I'm always saying, if you start, and it's a simple, have a heart rate monitor and check where it is. If it's at high heart rate, it's probably not tense because it stands. It's probably just super fatigued and trying to cope somehow or try to find a deal to do it. And in one way, and then I'm looking more also at the mental state. It sometimes doesn't matter. It's the heart rate. Of course it matters. But if it's a high heart rate because of stress or fatiguing, it needs to go down. It needs you then first make sure it relax or knows how to relax or do groundwork before it can continue, because it's going to block the whole training of your horse if it's fatiguing from exercise related, or maybe it's mentally not able to cope with the things you ask from him. Then you have to first mark on that behavioral task to see if the horse is getting more relaxed and able to cope with that exercise. So yeah, in that way, also monitoring, using those heart rate monitors can really help to get an idea where you have to start with the puzzle of this horse.
For Friesian horses, is it more common to have anhidrosis, and how do you recommend addressing that in training, especially knowing that Friesians are 70% more fatigued than warm bloods?
Yeah, first of all, the Friesians are not 70% more fatigued than warm bloods. We saw in the same exercise that 70% of the Friesian got fatigued. Well, we didn't saw that in warm bloods sport horses. And now we saw, of course, it was related to the training program. And if you change the training program, none of those horses got fatigued anymore. We know that anhidrosis also occurs with warm bloods or thoroughbred horses. So for all horses, I would not only specify this for Friesian horses, but if it's warm weather or they sweat and they suddenly stop sweating, it's always an alarm. It's something you really have to contact with your vet. But if a horse, it's warm weather and it doesn't sweat or it stops sweating, you of course need to cool down that horse. And it needs to be able to recover from that. It's more a veterinary, how do you call it? Wouldn't call it disease, but a veterinary problem which should be treated effectively before this horse can go back to normal training.
Next question, just asking you to clarify what was some of the earlier slides from the test that you talked about. Friesian, is this true that Friesian horses tend to find it harder to become fitter for more intensive work, but if it's done gradually and the training is built up correctly, can they become just as fit as any other breed?
Yes, I think it's a nice summary. It's a lot of time thought that they're not as fit as warm blood horses, but actually the start of the training and treating the training programs differently, in the end, we see that they are as fit as warm blood sport horses. And of course, they move differently. There are different breeds, but they can do the work. If we're talking about dressage and driving work, actually, I'm not talking about going 4-star eventing course with your Friesian.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, but the normal work, they're as fit. They can be as fit as normal, just as the warm blood horses. Yes.
And then how do you tell the difference between a lazy horse and a tired horse?
It's a good question. I think again, sorry for the repetition here. Use the heart rate monitor. If you see that your horse is just having easy low heart rate doing the work, and it's not willing to work anymore, okay, you can discuss lazy. I would always think when your horse is lazy and you think the horse is lazy, and of course when you have higher heart rate, it's probably fatiguing, but you think, is he lazy or is he fatigued? Okay, if you can exclude the fatigue level, then always find a little bit why does it feel lazy? Are there maybe other things why he's not able to work or willing to work? Because I think my experience is that horses are, and especially like Friesian, but all horses, they should be able to work with us and should be willing to work. And if they're not doing that, we should think about ourselves and think and review your training program and your training, what you're doing, and maybe your management or your equipment, your saddle. Why is something bothering that horse? I don't think a lot of horses are on purpose lazy.
And then can you clarify what free movement is? So like if we let a horse out into the pasture and he's not walking around, is that still counting as free movement? Does it, does the paddock size come into play there, or the terrain?
Yeah, a bit the paddock size, of course, because if you have a paddock by as big as your stable from 3 to 3, and you can say, then they're not able to really move around, and probably then the horse knows, I'm going to stand because it's not a lot. But if they have a paddock which they can perform walk, trot, and canter in, so it's big enough, they can do the 3 gaits, and then of course in the end they decide to stand still. That's their decision. That's still fine, but they have the option to do that. And that's a bit what we want to ask. They have still recovery day, and some horses are very happy to roam around, and some horses are just happy standing still, but they should have the ability to do the 3 gaits, walk, trot, and canter. And then if they then stand still, it's fine because they just have the option to do otherwise.
Okay. And then are there any heart rate monitors that you recommend, or where can you find such a, heart rate monitor for a horse?
Yeah, I can imagine there are quite some out there. What I would give as a general tip, use validated heart rate equipments. There are not a lot of them out there which are validated. Validated means like if you're going to start measuring the heart rate of your horse, you want to know if I'm measuring it gives the heart rate 100, it is actually 100. So it's tested with what we call the golden standard, that it gives an accurate heart rate. And at the moment for horses, we have 2 devices. One device is Equimetre for Arioneo. It's a French device. And the other one is Polar for horses, Polar with the equine belt and the Polar sensor. So a bit depending on what you want or what you prefer. Those 2 are validated and you can use properly with horses and Friesian horses.
Okay. And then next question is, does this information also apply to other cold-blooded horses like an Irish cob or a Haflinger, for example? Could we apply the same,
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, we didn't have done these extensive studies with all the other breeds, but we measure a lot of different breeds. And I have to say, I'm always a bit cautious with more cold-blooded breeds, like what's he telling here, the Haflinger, but also RPEs, Irish cobs. We see a little bit the same fjords also. A lot of those horses have a little bit the same tendency training-wise, like Friesian horses, definitely not all, but again, measure them and then you would know it. But we see there again changing it's not actually the horse that's maybe not meant to be sporty, or how do we say it, it's actually training a little bit the training program so it fits the horse instead of the horse should fit the training program. And then we see that those horses also adapt quite good. But yeah, we see it a bit more in cold-blooded horses as well.
And is the heart rate of a Friesian horse also related to their age? Like in humans, is there theoretical maximum or minimum heart rates based on age?
Yeah, there's quite some debate there on scientific level. It's not such a strong relationship as we see in humans. So in humans, you really have those, and it's also a very rule of thumb there that you have your maximum, the maximum heart rate minus your age. But in horses, it's not as clear. It's definitely not decreasing as much with age as we see with humans. And especially if we're talking about Friesian horses, it's sub-maximal exercise dressage. We hope we never hit the 200 values in a riding arena or driving around. So actually, we don't see that when horses get older, their heart rate decreases as much. It's the same thing that resting heart rates in humans decrease when you get more fitter, you get more endurance capacity. In horses, we don't see that resting heart rates really decrease as much because they have already a very low heart rate.
Can you measure lactate levels in a non-invasive way? So can you only do that by collecting blood?
Yeah, sorry. At the moment, still, yes. They are doing nice studies to see if we can do it non-invasively. I have to say, looking back in the last 50 years, we do the studies. In the beginning, we really need to draw tubes of blood. Now we only need really a micro drop of blood. So it's not even a drop of blood anymore. So it's really less. That means, yeah, we can do it quite less invasively, but still you need a little pinch to get a drop. Yeah.
Maybe one day, huh?
One day, who knows?
Should we canter a horse that has a weak back?
Very good question. I think first, if a horse, it ties a little bit into, okay, is the horse able to do the basic work before you can sit on it as a rider? Because I think all horses, not only Friesian horses, should we have proper groundwork and proper muscle strength before we can start sitting on the horse. If you have a horse that's really weak and really having trouble already unmounted for you as a rider, having to do that, for example, lunging or doing groundwork, able to carry himself and to do walk, trot, and canter, then probably first you have to improve that before you can do with rider walk, trot, or canter. And then canter, of course, comes at last. So definitely, if you have very weak backs or hindquarters, whatever, it can depend on what the horse has, but is it very weak? I should first advise you to first work on groundwork and muscle strengthening exercises before you start going cantering with those horses.
If we're looking for a heart rate monitor, are there any particular features in heart rate monitors that you find more helpful? Like, are there certain features that, like, if you were shopping for one, you would say, I really like to have these features. They would be important for this type of evaluation.
I think what I see with the most riders is that you want to see the heart rate when you're riding. So you want to see it on your watch. That's the most practical thing in the end, because you can have it on your phone, but you cannot see the heart rate when you're riding. And if you have to recall the heart rate afterwards, it's more difficult. Till now, maybe you have some kind of glass where you can see it in or whatever, but the experience is to have it visible on your watch so you can see it directly when you're riding, and it should be able to log, of course, the session. And I would also advise, if you have a heart rate monitor, that it contains GPS, because you then correlate the speed with it. And if you use Polar or the Equimetti, the other ones, they always have an accelerometer in it, so then you can even use it indoors to specify gates, etc. So that's also a nice feature, because if you're not always riding outdoors, this can help you.
Emma asks, she says her horse is nearly 6 years old, but he's really only been in proper work for 4 months. She said, I assume I need to treat him as a young horse, as he will get used to this load over time. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. And that's actually, a lot of times we think, okay, he's 6, or he's been a broad mare, or he has been whatever, not working properly. Horses in the pasture are not used to carrying rider weight. So still those horses need to be treated as young horses. So it still will need probably a year, 1.5 years before the bones and all the other tissues are used to carrying rider weight. So treat him like a 3-year-old, even if he's 6.
Okay.
It doesn't go faster or something when they're older. It's a myth.
Right. That would be nice if that was the case, especially for humans.
Yes.
So Bree, she's been doing a fitness test every 8 weeks with her 7-year-old Friesian since she watched your last webinar.
Oh.
Normally she does 3 to 4 days per week training and only 2 canter sessions per week. For the fitness test, she does 2 minutes walk, 3 minutes trot, 1 minute canter, and then change directions and do the same thing. And she says the heart rate drops to around 80 in between directions, but 1 minute of canter sends his heart rate between 140 and 160. And that seems to be more to the 160 side if the temperature is warm. During the 3 minutes of trot, his heart rate stays around 110 to 120 beats per minute. Would you say this is a good fitness level for between first and second level dressage? And then she wants to clarify that she's lunging, not riding during the fitness test.
Okay.
A lot of information there. Hopefully you got it.
Yeah, it's a lot of information. Very specific question.
But she's following your advice, so that's a good
start. I definitely want to compliment you that you follow the advice and really try to monitor and track your horse. So that's a very big good things for you. What I would say, because of the lunging, it would be interesting to know what the horse is doing when you're riding the horse. If the heart rate is even as high, because it can be that with lunging, because it's a smaller circle and the speed is a little bit less controlled, which can be a bit higher with lunging than when you're riding the horse, that's causing the high heart rate. To be in the, what you say, first and second level dressage, it is okay, but it's actually, I would see it a little bit going down in the heart rate levels of the canter, but maybe this is caused because it's done with lunging, and maybe while riding it at canter, the heart rates are lower. If not, you will probably need a little bit more time before he's those the heart rate levels will drop also at canter, so he can do easier the canter work. So I think, yeah, sometimes you just need to stick a little bit to the program.
Yeah.
But yeah, definitely doing a nice job there.
Okay, and then are there any specific things that you need to keep in mind when you're training a senior Friesian when we're talking about following this type of training advice?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think for all senior horses, you need to, of course, always monitor a little bit how well they're still starting. Are they a little bit stiff? Do they need a little bit more longer warming up? And again, here, when you monitor your senior horse, whether it's a Friesian or another horse, it can really help you to see. Sometimes we have registrations where we see senior horses that the first 20 minutes or something, it just takes more effort, as I call it, and then they get more supple and warm, and then suddenly it gets easier on them. If that still happens, it's quite good. But if you see that the time takes still, it will take longer and longer before it gets easier on him, then you really have to realize, yeah, you can monitor a little bit. Okay, is it still balancing out with the work I'm asking for that horse? So yeah, what I would advise with senior horses, and of course a little bit depending on the age, but if they're like 20 years plus, it's no limit for the horse. If he's veterinary sound and he's happy, keep up nice training the horse, keep on doing the work. You would probably help him to do a little bit of those strength exercises with higher intensity, just short bout, 30 seconds, 1 minute of a little bit of canter, or maybe doing a bit of hill work. So because strength will probably lose a little bit faster with age. So you probably keep him longer healthy if he's able to do that. But yeah, monitor that well and evaluate those sessions properly.
And what is a good heart rate when we're talking about beats per minute during an intensive training session? How do you decide if you need 1 or 2 days recovery after that sort of intensive training session? And then for the recovery days, can you also do 2 to 6 intervals per session till 120 beats per minute?
Now, good question. To answer this question, there is a large, what I always said, a large difference between individuals in Friesian horses. What is a high intensity and not? And we see that even these differences related to heart rate are in Friesian horses sometimes larger than what we see in warm blood horses. We have horses that reach their anaerobic threshold at a heart rate of 140, and we have Friesian horses who reach that at a heart rate of 180. And if you don't know that anaerobic threshold in relation to lactate, I cannot advise a good heart rate here, because I now would say like, okay, 140 is a good heart rate, for example. It can be a good heart rate for your horse, but it can be really too light for another horse, or it can be way too much for another one. So I I'm very cautious, only the below 120, that's for all horses low intensity, but above that we see large differences. So you really need to have a reference value there with a standardized exercise test, measuring your anaerobic threshold of those horses to answer this question. For the recovery days, you can definitely do more intervals if the heart rate keeps below 120. You will see after a while, if you increase the duration or you increase the frequency of the intervals and the heart rate starts to increase slowly, that probably then you start to fatigue for the same level. So then you have hit your frequency or duration.
So question for me, so if we wanted to follow that advice and figure out what our anaerobic threshold is it as simple as, performing one of those standardized exercise tests and having our veterinarian there to take a blood sample afterwards? Could that give us, could we measure the lactic acid levels if we work with our veterinarian? I mean, if you're really performing at a high level and wanting to optimize training, would that be something worth considering doing?
Yeah, and I would not even say it on a high level. It maybe sounds a bit odd, and we're not completely used to that maybe in horses, but we see it more and more, and we do it, of course, in the, we did it for the Friesian studbook now, but they continue doing it with all the young horses and the young stallions, because it's just a standardized exercise test who gives you an idea, okay, what should I do with this horse? So now we can target the training programs for those stallions to say, okay, maybe this horse can do a little bit more trot, this horse can do more canter, this horse needs to be 30-second canter. And that standardized exercise test is, you can perform it in with warming up and cooling down in 20 minutes. What you have to realize is that you need a veterinarian. You need to draw at least 4 or 5 times a drop of blood. So one time is not good enough to calculate the anaerobic threshold. And you probably need a veterinarian who's a little bit used to exercise testing. It's different equipment than normal lactate measurements where they use for colics or something. That's a practical note, but if we have vets who wants to know more, please contact, we can always help.
Super. Okay, and this might be one of those contact you situations too. Natasha's asking what the ideal workout plan would be for her 12-year-old pre-St. George horse. Would that be something, I mean, you probably couldn't give her a general plan, but you could certainly work with her, correct, if she contacted you?
Yeah, we can definitely, and that's actually would be like you can make an individual plan for the horse depending on where he is at the training status and what the goal is. And that's something you can really nicely work out with individual training programs. Yes.
Super. And Mark asks, is it better to have high intensity training on the first day of the week, or is it better at the end of the week, or does it even matter?
Yeah, depends. I mean, I like your question because what's the beginning, the first day or of the week and the end day? It depends on what do you do after the last day, then starts then the first day again. But it's not really the last or the first day. That's a bit what we want to point out with that. The training routine is like we have an intense day followed by 1 or 2 recovery days and again an intense day. And I wouldn't put like the highest intense day at the end of the week. But if the rest of the week, the 4-6 days before that were very low intensity, then you can definitely put it at the end of the week. But it's less effective because then he had 6 days of recovery and 1 intense day. And then again, 6 days of recovery and 1 intense day. That's not an optimal timing. So really try to change a little bit to 1 day where they work a little bit harder, but maybe shorter, and then have an easy recovery, 2 days, and again, a day where they work a little bit harder and shorter, followed by 2 easy days, for example. I think that's a pattern which we see, and we have a lot of experience with that. That works for a lot of horses to get into the right training rhythm.
And Natasha asks, could you give us an example of like an ideal warm-up session that could be performed like in the warm-up arena before a dressage test? Like how much exercise do we want to do in that warm-up arena before we take our test?
Yeah. Now, assuming that the horses are fit for the test. So now I'm just assuming that those horses are fit to what we call compete, and it's not very high demanding to do that competition test. Then at least you want to have a proper warm up, but at least contains around 10 till 50 minutes. That's the minimum. I want to point that out. So we're talking about walk and a bit of trot and canter. They should be able to perform. What is important here? Walking is always good. So rather walk 10 minutes. If you want to walk longer, it's okay. But if it's very cold weather, depending on where you live, or your horse is very fresh, you need to think about a little bit, okay, what's warming up my horse? Only walking will not warm up the horse. You need to include a little bit of trot and canter, but also important, don't make the warm up too long or perform all the exercises. It should be still fresh enough to go to the competition test. So a warm up from an hour is probably quite long. So we would point out mostly around 20-25 minutes would be optimal. And if you need to do some technical exercises, you can have a little bit of a recovery period at walk in between, and then to do some more technical work before you enter the test. But yeah, not too short and not too long.
We have several questions here. People want you to please repeat the brand of the heart rate monitors that you mentioned.
Oh yeah, we have the Polar, and I think Polar is it's the one that has also an equine belt, which is important because you need something to put around the horse to collect the heart rate. We work a lot with the Polar belts, and the other one is Equimetre. I'm not sure if I pronounce it correctly. On my Dutch, it's a French name, and I pronounce it as a Dutch person. But Equimetre from Arioneo, they have also a nice heart rate validated monitor they use for sport horses.
Coral asks, is there an absolute maximum heart rate that we should never exceed, or any heart rate that we shouldn't exceed? I think we talked about 120 beats per minute. You know,
that's low intensity. Yeah, I would say if assuming that we're doing dressage and normal driving with our horses, I think if you're really gonna hit around 200 or above that one, you're really doing high intensity, and you could ask a little bit yourself, okay, is this functional for the goals I have with my horse? So definitely not maximum heart rate going to 220 or more with those horses, because they're not thoroughbreds doing maximum exercise. It's sub-maximal exercise, dressage and driving. So it should have sub-maximal heart rates, and probably not very functional for those horses to really perform a lot of work on the highest maximum heart rates.
Okay. And then Erica asks, I'm not sure if she's talking about, when we say sport Friesian, if she's talking about a more modern Friesian, or if she's talking about a Friesian cross, which in the United States that's commonly referred to as a Friesian sport horse. But she's asking maybe in the difference between the builds of Friesian horses or even crosses, have you seen them be able to handle more or less intensity compared to like your traditional Friesian?
Yeah, we have tested a lot of Friesians and different, how do we say it, crossbred Friesians, but actually the differences are not that clear between older original breeds or older breeds. We see older breeds who are really well able to cope with sport demands, and we see horses which maybe should have more sport because they're crossbred, but still having the same issues as we see with normal Friesians. So at the moment, and maybe it's just too short generation-wise, physiologically-wise, till it's all moved. But I cannot say, based on what we have seen, that there are really physiological benefit that those one group of horses performs better or is able to manage better the effort of training than other groups of those horses.
Okay. And then this is our last question. Oh, maybe not. Okay, I'm going to tell you guys, last call for questions here. Okay, we've taken up a lot of Dr. Munster's time, and it's getting late in the Netherlands, so I want to make sure she has some time this evening. So if you're thinking of asking a question, this is the last call. So Suzanne says she always trains alone. Can she train with a heart rate monitor that she can read herself during training? I know you touched on the watch. Would that be the heart rate monitor she would want to look for, is the one with the watch?
Yes, yeah, the one with the watch, because you can definitely train then alone and monitor during this training session alone, and then afterwards you can watch it on your phone or your laptop to see how the graph looks, but you can see it during your training. You don't need somebody else to do that. No, definitely not.
And then Emma asks, would show jumping and working hunter classes at low level be too much for Friesian for the heart rate? And you've touched on that too. It really depends on the horse. Monitor the heart rate.
Some horses really can do this, and some horses I would say no. But maybe not now, maybe in a year. That's the question. That's always depend on the training level.
But you can get an objective answer to that question by using a heart rate monitor, right?
Definitely. You can see, is my horse able to do that in a normal way with not too much high intensity or not?
Yep. And then the last question is, this is coming from somebody that lives in Florida, which is in the southern United States. The humidity is very high there during the summer. Are there special recommendations for warming up prior to the show? Like if we're working in an environment where we know the heat and humidity is going to probably impact the horse, what should we do differently in those cases?
Yeah, if we're talking about hot and humid conditions, then we're talking a little bit more about how can we optimize the thermoregulation of that horse as well. And this counts for all horses actually, and for Friesian horses as well. But we should then shorten the time of the warm-up. Of course, they need a little bit of warm-up, but you can do some walk in hand. But the longer the time horses spend in warm and humid weather, the hotter they will get. They're not able to cool down themselves anymore. It will take quite some time. So you actively, really aggressively actually have to help them cool down. So what we do is then you can make sure you have your warm-up not too long, talk about 10, max maybe 50 minutes, and then between the warm-up and the test we can do some pre-cooling to cool the horse down again with ice water, so it can decrease a little bit the score temperature, and then you do the test, and directly after the test make sure you are able to cool it as well properly.
Okay, and then if we wanted to make an investment of a heart rate monitor, are we talking about thousands of dollars, hundreds of dollars, or euros? I mean, is it a huge investment, or is this something that's pretty affordable for most horse owners?
Yeah, it depends a bit on we have the two options with the two validated one. The Polar is definitely much cheaper than the Equimetric. The Equimetric is more around thousands of dollars, and Polar is hundreds of dollars.
Okay.
200, I think, something you have already your equipment.
Probably still, though, relatively a very small expense, you know, in the big scheme of things. If you're
in the big scheme of things of horses, and I think regarding the training and welfare of your horses, it gives you very valuable information, which you can help to optimize the training of your horse. So yeah, if you look about that, it's both of those figures are within affordable things because it's a one-time investment, and of course you use it. You use it a lot, but you can use it on multiple horses as well.
Super. And then if people have more questions or they want to get in touch with you to craft a personal training program for their horse, what's the best way for them to reach you?
Yeah, the best way to reach me is, shall I then take this one?
Yep.
Oh, does it still work? Is to the email address, the hello@equinintegration.com. I think that's the fastest way to get in touch with me.
Well, I want to thank you very much for being here tonight. This was fantastic information. I hope we can get this spread as far and wide as we can. There's been a lot of heart emojis popping up during your presentation, so it's really resonating with people, and it's very kind of simple information that we can apply, but has you know, just such a wide range of benefits for our horses. So if you're training or performing, even if you're doing something at home or you're a Grand Prix rider, you know, there's a place for your advice in every single training program. So we want to thank you for doing this for us on behalf of the Fenway Foundation for Friesian Horses. Thank you all of you that you attended this webinar today. It was very good information. This was recorded and it will be in our library probably within the next a day or two, so be looking for that, and you can explore this webinar and all the educational articles that we have in our library at www.fenwayfoundation.com. So thank you again all for joining us. Dr. Munsters, thank you, and we hope to see you all at our next webinar.